Minutes after giving birth, she was handed divorce papers and smiled. Why would a woman smile at the worst moment of her life? Before we go any further, before we peel back the layers of what happened next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now stay with me, because this story doesn't start with betrayal. It starts with hope, the kind of hope that smells like disinfectant and baby powder, that hums softly under fluorescent hospital lights, and that convinces you, just for a moment, that everything painful you endured was worth it. Emily Carter was 38 years old when she gave birth to her first child in a small suburban hospital outside Columbus, Ohio. It had taken her years to get there, years of quiet disappointment, polite smiles at baby showers, and late-night conversations with herself she never admitted out loud. Her husband, Daniel, sat beside her during labor, holding her hand, saying all the right things, but even then, something felt slightly off. Emily noticed it in the pauses between his words, in the way his phone stayed face down on the table, and how he left the room a little too often. She told herself she was overthinking it. People do strange things under stress, she thought. This was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. The nurse placed the baby in Emily's arms, warm and trembling, his cry sharp and real, cutting through every fear she had carried for nearly a decade. She whispered his name, Noah, tasting it like a promise she intended to keep. Daniel kissed her forehead, but his eyes drifted toward the door, as if he were waiting for someone. Emily didn't see the envelope right away. It sat on the side table, plain, white, with her name typed neatly on the front. When a hospital administrator finally cleared her throat and explained, carefully, that legal documents had been delivered and required acknowledgement, Emily felt the room tilt slightly, like standing up too fast. The papers were divorce filings, filed 2 weeks earlier. Effective immediately, Daniel stood up, straightened his jacket, and said, "I didn't know how else to do this." Emily read the first page slowly, then the second. Her hands didn't shake. Her chest didn't tighten the way she expected. Instead, she smiled. Not because it was funny, not because it didn't hurt, but because in that moment, something she'd been trying not to see finally came into focus. Have you ever felt that kind of clarity, the kind that arrives only after the damage is already done, the kind that hurts less than the waiting ever did? 6 months earlier, Emily had believed she was living a quiet, stable life. Daniel worked in logistics, traveled often, blamed long hours and missed calls on deadlines and delayed flights. Emily worked remotely, rearranging her schedule around his, convincing herself that flexibility was love. She ignored the small signs, the unfamiliar cologne clinging to his shirts, the sudden interest in fitness and new clothes, the way he spoke about starting fresh, without ever saying from what. When Emily became pregnant after years of trying, Daniel reacted with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He told friends he was excited. He told Emily he was terrified, which she took as honesty, not hesitation. What Emily didn't know then was that Daniel had already decided to leave. He had met someone else, younger, unburdened by fertility treatments and hospital visits, someone who made him feel, in his words, uncomplicated. He filed for divorce quietly, telling himself he'd handle it after the baby was born. That waiting made him considerate. But life doesn't pause for convenience. The timing wasn't fate. It was avoidance catching up. And when the papers arrived in that hospital room, Daniel expected tears, anger, maybe begging. What he got instead was a smile that unsettled him more than shouting ever could. Emily's smile came from a realization she would later struggle to explain. In that moment, holding her son, she understood that the worst thing had already happened, and she was still standing. Everything else, she realized, would be survivable. Daniel left the hospital that afternoon. He didn't ask to hold Noah again. Emily watched him walk away down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, and she felt grief, yes, but also relief, sharp and undeniable. The story she had been forcing herself to live was finally over. Have you ever been hurt so deeply that it strangely freed you at the same time? The months that followed were not easy. Emily moved into a smaller apartment closer to her sister. Sleep came in fragments. Money was tight. Some nights, she cried quietly on the bathroom floor so Noah wouldn't hear. Other nights, she stared at his chest rising and falling, terrified of doing everything wrong. Daniel sent child support. He visited occasionally, awkward and distracted, already half gone. Emily stopped expecting him to be someone he wasn't. That, more than anything, became her turning point. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped apologizing for needing help. She stopped pretending that endurance was the same thing as love. 2 years later, Emily stood in a park, watching Noah wobble toward her with a plastic truck clutched in his hand. The sun was warm, the air smelled like cut grass, and for the first time in a long while, her laughter came easily. She wasn't grateful for what Daniel did, but she was grateful for what she learned. That smile in the hospital wasn't strength arriving out of nowhere. It was truth finally being acknowledged. Sometimes the moment that breaks you is also the moment that gives you your life back. If you were in her place, handed heartbreak when you expected joy, how do you think you would have reacted? Would you have seen the ending or the beginning? He walked in quietly, like someone entering the wrong room, holding a thin folder instead of flowers, his voice low and measured, as if volume alone could expose him. He didn't look at the baby. He didn't look at her face for more than a second. He placed the papers on the tray beside the bed and said it was already filed, already decided, already done. There was no apology that meant anything, no explanation that answered the real question. Emily noticed the nurses first, how their movements slowed, how one of them paused with a clipboard half-raised, pretending not to listen while hearing everything. The room felt smaller, heavier, filled with the sound of a newborn breathing and an ending happening at the same time. Emily didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask why. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, folded the corner of the blanket around Noah's shoulder, and smiled. A small, contained smile that confused everyone in the room. Somewhere down the hallway, a woman waited without being named, without being introduced, but her presence pressed against the moment all the same. And what he didn't know was that while he believed he was in control, something else was already set in motion, quietly, deliberately, and far beyond his reach. Before we continue, take a moment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this story is traveling. And if this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss stories like this, stories that unfold slowly, honestly, and stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The pain in her body was still sharp, a deep, aching reminder that she had just brought a life into the world. Every small movement sent a quiet warning through her muscles. Every breath felt earned. But strangely, the physical pain was easier to place than what was happening in her chest. That part felt numb, like a room where the lights had been turned off without warning. She stared at the ceiling tiles and focused on counting them, not because it helped, but because it gave her something steady to hold on to. Inside her mind, memories surfaced without permission. The years she paused her career so Daniel could take promotions that required travel. The friendships she let fade because weekends were always about his schedule. The medical appointments she attended alone because he was stuck at work. Each sacrifice lined up quietly, not accusing, just present. Daniel stood near the foot of the bed with a confidence that felt rehearsed. He spoke as if this moment had been practiced in advance, his words efficient, emotionally distant, almost managerial. He talked about timing, about logistics, about how this was for the best, never once acknowledging the weight of the room or the life breathing softly between them. Emily noticed how easily he filled the silence, how comfortable he seemed hearing his own voice. She chose not to interrupt. Silence, she realized, was the only thing in that room that still belonged to her. Nurses moved in and out, their shoes squeaking faintly against the floor, their eyes careful, respectful, unwilling witnesses to something deeply personal unfolding without sound. Inside, Emily wasn't shocked. Shock requires surprise, and somewhere deep down, she had been preparing for this long before the papers appeared. What she felt instead was calculation, slow and deliberate. She thought about her son's future, about what stability would actually look like, about what kind of strength mattered now. She understood, with sudden clarity, that reacting emotionally would give Daniel the moment he expected, the moment that would confirm his version of the story. She wasn't willing to give him that. Have you ever realized, in the middle of losing something, that staying quiet was the first real choice you'd made in years? As Daniel spoke, confident and certain, Emily listened, not to his words, but to what they revealed. And with every second of her silence, something inside her began to shift, not toward anger, but toward resolve. As the room settled into an uneasy quiet, one of the nurses returned with a clipboard, her voice gentle, professional, almost careful. She asked Emily to confirm a signature from earlier that morning, something standard, something already handled. Emily nodded without asking questions, recognizing the form immediately, remembering the weight of the pen in her hand just hours before labor intensified, remembering how she had paused, reread one line twice, and then signed anyway. The nurse thanked her and moved on, but Daniel noticed. He asked what it was, half interested, already gathering his jacket like a man checking items off a list. The nurse replied simply that everything was already on file. No further details. No clarification. Emily said nothing. She didn't look at Daniel. She focused instead on Noah's tiny fingers curling and uncurling against her skin, grounding herself in the present moment while something unspoken sat quietly between them. Daniel didn't press the issue. He assumed it was paperwork that followed birth, the kind of forms no one really reads. He assumed, as he had assumed so many times before, that Emily would handle the background details while he moved on to what came next. His posture reflected it, relaxed, almost relieved, as if a heavy obligation had finally been lifted. He spoke about lawyers and schedules and how they would figure things out, already framing the future in terms that suited him. Emily listened, calm on the surface, fully aware that his confidence was built on incomplete information. He believed the papers he brought had closed the door. He believed this moment was the end of a chapter he controlled. What he didn't realize was that while he was focused on what he had taken, something else had already been put in place, quietly, legally, and with intention. He thought the papers ended everything. They didn't. Before she was his wife, before hospital rooms and quiet betrayals, she was Grace Carter, the name she used before marriage, the name her college professors still remembered. Grace was intelligent in a way that never asked for attention. She didn't dominate rooms or speak just to be heard. She listened, absorbed, connected details other people missed. She studied economics at a state university, worked 2 part-time jobs, and graduated without debt because independence mattered to her more than appearances. Friends described her as steady, the person you called when life tilted unexpectedly. She wasn't flashy, never chased status, never confused noise with value. She believed in building things slowly, carefully, with intention. When she met Daniel, she believed she had found someone who respected that steadiness. In the early years, she kept her name professionally, kept her routines, kept her sense of self. But marriage, as it unfolded, began asking for small compromises that didn't feel dangerous at first. She turned down a promotion because it required relocation during a year Daniel wanted stability. She shifted to remote work so dinners could be timed around his schedule. She became the one who remembered birthdays, managed appointments, smoothed over conflicts. None of it felt like sacrifice in the moment. It felt like partnership. That's how these things usually begin. Over time, the balance shifted without announcement. Grace became the background that allowed Daniel's life to move forward more easily. Her ambitions didn't disappear, they just waited. She told herself there would be time later, after the next milestone, after things settled. She absorbed the pauses, the missed acknowledgments, the way her efforts became expected rather than appreciated. Daniel never asked her to give these things up explicitly. He simply accepted them, and she filled in the gaps. Looking back, it's easy to name what was lost. Living through it, it just felt like love doing what love was supposed to do. What Daniel never noticed was how much Grace adjusted herself to fit the marriage. He didn't see the articles she bookmarked and never returned to, the graduate program she postponed, the confidence that slowly quieted itself. He didn't hear the internal negotiations she made each time she chose peace over confrontation. Grace wasn't weak. She was committed. There's a difference, and it matters. When people talk about sacrifice, they often imagine grand gestures. But most of it happens quietly, in everyday decisions no one applauds. Sitting in that hospital room years later, holding her son, Grace understood something with painful clarity. She had given up more than Daniel ever noticed, more than he ever counted, and more than he ever deserved to dismiss so easily. And if you're listening to this, ask yourself honestly, how many parts of yourself have you slowly set aside for someone who never fully saw them? How many choices have you called compromise when they were really just quiet erasures? Grace wasn't remembering her past to feel regret. She was remembering it to reclaim it. Because the woman she was before him hadn't disappeared. She had only been waiting to be needed again. Years before the hospital, before the marriage began to fracture, there was an idea that started at their kitchen table. Grace had been the one sketching notes on a yellow legal pad, talking through logistics while dinner cooled beside her. She had noticed inefficiencies in regional shipping routes while consulting remotely for small retailers, patterns most people ignored because they required patience to see. She explained it to Daniel slowly, carefully, excited in a restrained way that was uniquely hers. He listened, asked questions, and encouraged her to keep going. At first, it felt like collaboration. She built the framework, ran projections late at night, and outlined a model that could scale without burning out its operators. Daniel saw potential, not just in the idea, but in how easily it could be presented. When they decided to move forward, it was framed as a team effort. But somewhere between the planning and the first investor meeting, roles shifted. Daniel was more comfortable speaking in rooms full of people. He liked the energy, the recognition, the handshakes. Grace preferred the work itself, the structure behind the scenes. It made sense, they told themselves, for him to be the face while she handled operations, strategy, and problem-solving. That decision, like many others, didn't feel permanent at the time. It felt practical. Grace wrote emails he signed. She prepared presentations he delivered. She corrected mistakes quietly before they reached clients. When praise came, it landed on him. When problems surfaced, she fixed them without announcement. As the business grew, so did the imbalance. Industry articles mentioned Daniel by name. Panels invited him to speak. People referred to the company as his vision. Grace attended events as his wife, not his partner, answering questions politely while standing half a step behind him. She told herself the recognition didn't matter, that results were enough, that success was shared even if credit wasn't. But invisibility has a way of wearing on you. It doesn't hurt all at once. It erodes you slowly, until one day you realize people no longer ask for your opinion because they've forgotten you have one. Daniel mistook her silence for acceptance. He mistook her restraint for dependence. He assumed that because she didn't demand acknowledgement, she didn't need it. What he never understood was that Grace's quiet wasn't weakness. It was discipline. It was observation. It was someone paying attention long before anyone realized it mattered. And while he stood comfortably in the spotlight he believed was rightfully his, Grace continued to document, to organize, to protect the foundation of something that had started as her dream. If you've ever watched someone else receive applause for work you carried in silence, you know the particular kind of ache that creates. But you also know this. Silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it means preparation. Before the hospital scene, before the newborn's first cry filled the room, there had been another quiet, decisive moment, one that most people would never notice. The prenup. Daniel's lawyer had insisted on it early in the marriage, framing it as routine, just to cover future contingencies, a legal formality no one expected to test. Grace had signed it, of course, because refusing wasn't an option, but she had read every line carefully, rereading certain paragraphs late at night while Daniel slept, tracing her finger along the fine print, noticing phrasing most would ignore. The tone was neutral, almost benign, but there was one clause tucked away, one sentence structured in a way that made no immediate impact but carried potential. At the time, it felt theoretical, academic, a technicality unlikely to ever matter. Daniel didn't ask about the details. He assumed that, like the rest of the marriage, signing meant surrender, that paperwork equaled control. But Grace had learned that contracts, like people, are layered. And that clause hadn't activated yet. Daniel walked out of the courthouse that afternoon with a smile that stretched too easily across his face, shaking hands with colleagues, feeling victorious as though the finality of signatures and stamps could erase the past months entirely. He was careful in his demeanor, composed, and entirely convinced that the legal system had affirmed his version of the story. Emily, or Grace, as she still thought of herself in private, watched it all quietly, from a distance, cataloging every movement, every triumphant gesture, every word of congratulation he received. She didn't flare, didn't shout, didn't betray the storm roiling inside her. Because she knew the difference between law and emotion, between surface and substance. While Daniel celebrated, she reached for her phone, dialing her lawyer with deliberate calm. Her voice was steady, measured, explaining details, asking questions, reviewing timelines, confirming that every decision, every paper, every clause she had prepared was accounted for. She didn't ask for revenge. She didn't ask for drama or to humiliate him publicly. She asked for clarity, for understanding, for the certainty that her life, her son's life, and her future would not be left to chance or assumption. And in that quiet, controlled call, the first moves of something deliberate were set into motion, invisible to everyone else, but entirely real. 3 days later, Daniel returned to the apartment, fully expecting a reaction. He imagined the anger, the tears, the confrontation he thought was inevitable. He rehearsed his words as he walked through the door, anticipating the moment that would confirm his control, that would validate the confidence he carried so easily in public and private alike. The apartment was quiet. Noah played on the floor, stacking blocks with small, deliberate hands, oblivious to the tension lingering in the air. Grace was in the kitchen, sipping coffee, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand answers or explanations. She simply existed, steady and present, as if the events of the past week were already behind her, cataloged and contained, rather than something that could unmoor her from the life she was building. Daniel's mind raced, searching for some sign, any crack in the facade, any glimpse of vulnerability he could exploit or interpret. Nothing came. The silence wasn't passive. It wasn't emptiness. It was precision, a calculated distance that made him uneasy in a way anger never had. He had believed confrontation, noise, outrage. Those were the tools of emotion, the predictable outcomes he understood and could manage. This absence of reaction unsettled him far more than fury ever could. He realized, too late, that her stillness was not surrender. It was strategy, patience, and foresight all wrapped together, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't in control of the story. That worried him more than anger ever could. Weeks earlier, in the quiet stretch of the hospital hallway, just hours before the newborn's first cries filled the room, Grace had paused with an still attached to her arm, her body trembling from exhaustion and relief in equal measure. A nurse handed her a clipboard, and she signed the document without much thought, or so it seemed. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, tracing her name across the page with a careful precision that masked the depth of her awareness. No one explained much. It was routine, something to finalize paperwork, something that seemed entirely unrelated to the chaos that would follow. Yet, even as her signature hit the bottom line, Grace understood the weight of what she had just done. Every word, every clause, every line was accounted for in her mind. She didn't sign out of obligation. She didn't sign because she was tired or distracted. She signed knowing, quietly, that this paper could change the way power was distributed, the way choices would unfold, and the way the future could be reclaimed on her terms. This wasn't about divorce. This wasn't about him. It was about her control, about her clarity, about setting the stage for the life she refused to surrender. When the lawyers reviewed the papers, something subtle shifted in the room. Daniel's attorney, confident and polished, nodded as if everything were routine, skimming lines and dates with practiced ease. Grace's lawyer, however, paused, frowned slightly, and leaned in, whispering questions and clarifications that hadn't been part of the usual procedure. The tone changed, imperceptibly at first, then unmistakably, as urgency began to seep into the conversation. Words were chosen carefully, voices lowered, and the rhythm of negotiation became deliberate, almost tense, like a game being played with invisible rules. Daniel shifted in his seat, sensing, without fully understanding, that the documents he had assumed were a formality were now commanding attention he hadn't anticipated. He tried to smile, tried to reassure himself that control was still his, but the subtle glances between the lawyers told a different story. And suddenly, the power balance changed. Weeks later, the midpoint of the storm arrived quietly, like an unmarked envelope that changes everything the moment it's opened. The acquisition of the company, the one Daniel had always presented as his vision, was finalized. Official announcements circulated in hushed tones, legal filings confirmed, investors nodded, and the valuation exceeded even the most optimistic projections they had discussed. Daniel smiled, of course, proud, satisfied, believing that success measured power, that numbers proved dominance, that the future was his to control. But Grace watched the news unfold from her small apartment, holding Noah in her lap, reading every detail with a calm that unnerved Daniel more than any argument could. She didn't react with emotion. She didn't gloat. She simply absorbed the information, cataloged it, understood the magnitude. Because the truth wasn't about the valuation, wasn't about the investors' nods, and wasn't about the headlines. The papers had done more than validate success. They had shifted the framework, setting the stage for consequences Daniel hadn't even imagined. And yet, as powerful as the acquisition was, the money wasn't the worst part. Daniel thought he had calculated every possible outcome, every contingency he could anticipate. He believed the prenup was a shield in his favor, a legal formality that protected him from any surprises. But Grace had read every line, memorized every phrase, understood the mechanisms hidden in plain sight. There was one clause, a single sentence tucked deep into the document. that had been dormant until precisely the conditions she had just fulfilled came into alignment. It activated only if the divorce was initiated by him, only within a specific postpartum window, and only after a liquidity event, like the one that had just finalized with the company acquisition. Daniel had unknowingly checked every box, walked straight into the exact circumstances the clause was designed to leverage. Grace didn't smile out of gloating. She didn't celebrate in the traditional sense. She simply allowed herself a quiet sense of acknowledgement, that careful planning, patience, and understanding of the rules she had agreed to long ago had shifted the power in a way Daniel had never imagined. The moment of realization was hers alone for now, and the room, though distant, would soon feel the weight of it. Daniel noticed it first in the room's atmosphere. The subtle pause, the sudden quiet from the lawyers who had moments ago been speaking in confident, clipped tones. Their eyes met his briefly, careful, measured, and then returned to their papers without explanation. Something had shifted, something he hadn't accounted for, and it started in the silence. He leaned forward, trying to catch a glance, a hint, anything that would reassure him that he still controlled the narrative. But as his gaze fell on Grace, sitting calm, composed, utterly unreadable, his face changed. The confidence he had carried so effortlessly for years began to crack, and a creeping unease spread through him. One that wasn't anger, one that wasn't fear, but something sharper, more disorienting. He asked one question, his voice steady despite the tremor he couldn't hide. "What does this mean?" And got no answer. Not a word, not a hint. Silence filled the space, and with it, the realization that the control he had always assumed was his alone was slipping away, moment by deliberate moment. And then the numbers landed, quiet and indisputable. The company, the one Daniel had taken credit for, had been valued in the acquisition at over $1 billion. Grace didn't cheer. She didn't raise her voice or seek validation. She didn't need witnesses to the truth. She had known it all along. The room held the weight of facts alone. $1 billion, fully realized, fully documented, fully irreversible. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read the filings, as the legal team recited the summary without fanfare, without emotion, treating it as routine business. But for Grace, the impact wasn't in shock. It was something deeper, more intimate. It was recognition of every sleepless night she had endured, every compromise she had made, every invisible contribution she had carried quietly. This was her acknowledgement, her reckoning, without theatrics, without spectacle, without anyone needing to applaud. And in that stillness, the truth was undeniable. Her foresight, her patience, and her careful planning had finally translated into power that could never be taken from her. Outside the room, the world continued unaware, investors and colleagues still applauding the deal, still congratulating Daniel as if nothing had shifted. Inside, Grace remained quiet, composed, her expression steady, her son asleep beside her, the calm in the eye of a storm he hadn't seen coming. Daniel scrambled, calling advisors, asking questions, searching for a loophole, a misstep, a single detail he could leverage. His confidence, so carefully maintained for years, faltered in private. The balance of control had changed, not with theatrics or confrontation, but with precision and patience. His reputation, long tied to the narrative he had constructed, began to wobble, not publicly yet, but in the circles that mattered, quietly shifting as whispers traveled through legal teams and investor calls. Grace didn't take everything. She didn't humiliate him. She didn't destroy him. She took what was fair, what had always been hers, and in doing so, she reclaimed her life without a sound. Grace never boasted. She didn't call reporters. She didn't post celebratory photos online or craft statements to make headlines. Her focus was on her son, on the small, quiet moments that truly mattered. Watching him learn to walk, hearing him laugh, tucking him in at night, making sure he felt safe and seen. Success, for her, wasn't measured in applause or recognition. It was measured in stability, in independence, in the knowledge that the life she built was sustainable, meaningful, and free from dependency on anyone else's validation. She moved through the world with deliberate quiet, carrying the weight of her achievements without needing to display them. True power, she understood, doesn't announce itself. It exists in the choices you make when no one is watching, in the patience that allows you to act deliberately, and in the calm confidence that comes from knowing you have reclaimed what was always yours. In the months that followed, Daniel faded from relevance, his confidence replaced by quiet confusion, His presence in the company reduced to a footnote as the systems Grace had built continued to operate flawlessly without him. Invitations he once relied on, opportunities he assumed were permanent, began to bypass him, redirected by contracts and decisions he had never anticipated. Meanwhile, Grace rebuilt on her terms, carefully, deliberately, and with attention to the life she truly wanted. She focused on her son, on work that mattered, on relationships that were reciprocal rather than transactional. There were no grand announcements, no proclamations of victory, no moments designed to provoke envy. Instead, every choice she made reinforced the stability and independence she had long cultivated quietly in the background. The loudest moment of all, the one that resonated far beyond any courtroom, any acquisition, any headline, was her silence, a calm that spoke louder than anger ever could, a presence that commanded respect without ever demanding it. Looking back, Grace understood the weight of dignity, the kind that isn't performed for anyone else but maintained for yourself. She reflected on timing, the moments she had waited, the decisions she had delayed, the pauses she had taken to ensure that every step was intentional. Patience, she realized, wasn't passive. It was active, a deliberate strategy, a quiet strength that shaped outcomes far beyond the noise of immediate reaction. In those reflections, she found closure, not through revenge, not through recognition, but through the knowledge that she had acted with clarity, with integrity, and with foresight. Every hardship, every sacrifice, every quiet choice had led her here, to a life reclaimed on her terms, measured not in applause, but in the enduring calm and certainty of knowing she had done what was right, in the right order, at the right time. Do you think she planned everything, or simply understood the rules better than he did? If this story stayed with you, like the video, it helps more than you know. And subscribe for stories that reward patience, stories where quiet strength, careful timing, and deliberate choices speak louder than noise ever could.